So nice to see many familiar faces. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited because, I think all of us have been navigating this topic of AI and taking it in different ways and different strides, whatever we can manage and what we can digest and what we're willing to explore. And I've had the real privilege of knowing Kelly and Ken in different contexts. I've worked with Ken co-presenting. Kelly, I've known she was actually a participant in a course I taught, and then we developed a professional relationship. I always look at them for guidance. What they're doing is always very thoughtful, and they're very much in tune with, I think, a lot of aspects of AI that sometimes are outside the fringe, in the sense that we always think of AI as tools, but the bias, some of the background of the technical background, etc. But just want to start introducing Kelly. Kelly is based in Florida, and she actually runs a fantastic podcast, and it's called Teaching Python Podcast. And she does that with a friend of hers, Sean, and she has taught in the US and international schools, AI literacy, digital literacy, design technology, and does a lot with coding. And I love the way she has engaged with coding to make sure it's accessible to kids, and in very practical and thoughtful ways. Ken is a distinguished professional in the field of education. He has done many different things, and he's a keynote. And Ken and I had the opportunity of doing some Google training at different schools, and he's recognized by the International Society for Technology and Education, and he was the proud recipient of the Digital Equity Professional Learning Network Excellence Award. So really, with such illustrious guests, welcome both of you, Ken and Kelly. And we're going to dig in straight away, because I think what we're going to do is we're going to have some questions, and then you're going to get to go together in a room and unpack some of these provocations and see what your colleagues in the rooms are thinking, and then we'll come back. So it's going to be a bit of back and forth. But the first thing that I would like to do is ask Kelly, just from your perspective, as you think of the last 18 months, what are some of the influences that you've seen AI large language models have on teaching approaches for students and teachers in your experience? What have you noticed since these have come onto the platform or into the world that we live in? What have you noticed about those?
It's such a loaded question. Thank you, John. It's so awesome to start with this question. I really have been thinking a lot about this. There's two lenses that I look, well, three that I look at this in the past 18 months. I'm looking at it as an educator only, like influence teaching approaches. I found that it's just impacted my teaching, because I'm constantly on this seesaw, right? Of do I focus on the desirable difficulties and make the students struggle, or do I give them AI and really focus on critical thinking and creativity? So these approaches and these outcomes have really shifted all of our thinking, especially at our school, where we've looked at pilots that can bring AI to fourth graders safely and just change the way that we're starting to send homework and assessments and really develop that. It's just it lowers these barriers to kids getting into problems. And so when I think about the teaching approaches, the teachers that I've been working with have all said, I really need to rethink this. This is a lot. This is a lot to process. And, you know, I'm trying to put this into things. They were processing it and they're like, wow, what can I do? What can I do? And how can I push them to get them where they are? So the biggest shift is just integrating things and making sure that the kids aren't cheating their way of the learning, and really focusing on the communication.
And I
Do you want
think
to
it's
add?
so interesting that tension that you're talking about is, do I get into kind of the critical thinking, kind of the humane side, or do I create prompts within AI and kind of that critical thinking? Where does that play, especially when you have something so powerful as that tool, as the large language model? Ken, what do you think are some notable successes and challenges that you've seen educators integrating these tools into their workflows, be it lessons, units, or curriculums?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Kelly just shared. I think and there's a couple of things for us to really look at when it comes to this in general, and that is the following. For those of us that have been around ed tech for a while, this is it's actually a quote I have in the book that I'm almost finished with a very close friend of mine, is from a song by The Who called "Won't Get Fooled Again." Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. You think about every time a new emerging tech has come around, there's always those that dive right in. There's those that are, I'm going to be hesitant, and then those that are going to be resistant. And that is no different than what we're seeing right now. And so the whole dive right in thing, to me, it has touched on things, to your point, around where a lot of educators are like, okay, I'm going to use it for lesson plan design. I'm going to use it for coming up with ideas. I'm going to use it for all these things. But then you have a slow to implement guidelines, guardrails, and guidance from many schools, school districts, and school systems because they don't understand it. And so the whole idea being, I'm going to wait before I establish a policy. And oftentimes that wait means block and then ask questions later, which exacerbates already existing digital inequities. But then there's also the whole idea around, if I'm using it solely for lesson plans or idea generation, then what I'm really doing is two things. One, I'm only using it at the surface level because in many cases it requires far more in-depth analysis as well as depth of understanding. But then also you run the risk of missing many of the, what I always say are the pitfalls, perils, and dangers we need to be concerned about around large language models and the automation of anything from bias to existing inequities that exist in education in general. So I am seeing a lot of usage around it, but again, for me, my whole thing, which is why I put it in the chat, is we really have to start taking a look at a couple of things. One, we have to, and Kelly even mentioned it, which is one of my favorite things to do, is I will interrogate the whole idea around cheating. Like, first of all, how do you define it? And what exactly does it look like? Because oftentimes cheating is associated with some sort of a resource that gives us more time or has us do things more efficiently. Okay, and my whole thing, even when it comes to the cheating conversation, is before we get to whether or not using AI is cheating, and I can share later what 3 ethical questions I always pose in my workshops. My thing is, what is a catalyst that leads to a learner saying, I'm going to allow something else that I don't really understand to do my work for me at the risk of being accused of cheating, rather than me asserting my own agency and taking ownership of my learning.
And I
So I
think
think that there's just my last comment is I think that there's this whole idea around we need to understand how it works. We need to understand that, first of all, it's not going away. Okay, because some people are like, well, it might be another thing. Wrong. Follow the money, and that'll be your answer. Okay, so it's not going away. And then now, what are the ways in which it can actually transform teaching and learning and increase, as I put in the chat, increase the urgency around incorporating information and media literacy across all of our content areas?
And I think that's really important, kind of that urgency that you bring up about this digital and media literacy, because I think we pay a lot of lip service to it, but it's often not as present as it should be. And the other thing, Ken, that I really like is that the idea of what is the reason behind the cheating? And let's not just focus on the cheating, what are we maybe creating as frameworks and lessons that engage people to want to do this? So that really segues nicely to my next question. Kelly, in what ways do you feel school leaders can support educators to address these ethical concerns surrounded around AI and LMSs in the classroom? And Ken talked about bias, there's plagiarism and privacy. What are you think some things that school leaders should be doing to support educators?
It's got to be proactive leadership first and foremost. Who's in it to really get in there, develop, implement these, these clear guidelines, these frameworks, I always like to think of Dan Heath's book. He talks about it's the upstream, the quest to solve problems before they happen, this upstream kind of philosophy. Our first knee-jerk reaction lasted about, I don't know, a week at our school where we're like, oh no, shut down. We're like, oh no, we're better than this. We're not going to shut down. We are getting people together. We had heads of schools coming in. They were very proactive. And so it's about trying to solve those problems upstream before they happen. We were concerned, well, teachers are going to start freaking out about cheating. Okay, so let's talk to them about what it means to cheat, solving that problem before it happens. Ethical guidelines. We were as a team, the ed tech team, have been digging into some of these early AIs that have gone widespread, where there was no privacy policy, there was no FERPA, there was no POPA, there was no GDPR, nothing was in their paperworks. And now a year and a half later, we're seeing those big AI models that now have pages on their website that said, hey, we're compliant. Another thing is like this holistic professional support for educators. We're constantly giving PDs. I know I'm meeting on a one-to-one basis with a lot of teachers and just sitting there listening to them brainstorm their new assignments. And that's this whole look that we're looking at the ethical, the responsible, but yet the creative, the innovative, the desirable outcomes that we want from learning. And
I
then the
think,
last one is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go
One more
ahead.
thing.
No,
And
please.
so we really need to anticipate like these potential ethical issues, the misuse. So as leaders, we really got to be in and proactively awaiting these and
And
solving it before it happens.
And what I love about what you're saying, it's about the leaders. This is not an IT help ticket that you send to the support team. This has to be from leadership, and not only top leadership, but middle management. And I think, and Ken put in the chat, is this idea of proactiveness instead of reactive. And I love your idea of the upstream. Let's anticipate this. Let's not wait till something happens, because I think sometimes schools, we like to react. And we need to be proactive. It's not that we don't have the talent and the skills in the room to do that. So Ken, building on that, from your own experience, what have you been doing? Because you work with schools and organizations on this topic. What are some of the things that you've in the guidelines to ensure there's this responsibility and this engagement with the ethical use? What have you been seeing, and what are you noticing as you facilitate that?
Well, so a couple of things. One, I think we have to establish a foundational agreement on what ethical use actually means, which is why I always pose three questions. So the first question I always pose is does my use violate the law, or does it violate explicit district or school system policy? And I stress explicit because what I often hear or see in digital citizenship policies, and I even question the use of citizenship in that context, but nevertheless, it's implied, and I'm like, well, implied is not good enough. Okay, what's explicit about the usage? The second question I always ask is, what if everyone did this, and how would I feel if someone did it to me? And I'll connect that to a story I'll share in a moment. And then the third question is, am I sacrificing long-term benefits for short-term gains? Those are the three questions I pose. And that's precisely why when it comes to a lot of these policies or the development of policy, I'm like, are we including learners in the conversation? I usually, with many schools where they're looking at adopting, or district, they're looking at adopting policy, I'm like, well, let's include students in the conversation. And the interesting thing, and this is where I go to the whole cheating thing, is I literally have had focus groups use a large language model to create an essay. And I'm like, great, it did the essay for you, so we can turn it in, you got your grade, right? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, now let's take a look at that third question. First of all, what long-term benefits and gains am I sacrificing for this short-term gain? And then second of all, read what it wrote. And this goes back to what I shared before around media and information literacy, is because this whole idea around, are you okay with something that you don't really know that much about speaking for you? And then when we get into the whole idea around these policies, it's again, my whole thing is a policy dynamic, and does it provide guidance, guidelines, and guardrails, or is it restrictive and punitive? Because in many cases, I've seen this to be true, is when a district announces that they're blocking, for example, all large language models, what do you think the first thing the kids are going to do when they get home? Those that have internet access. So do you see how it can exacerbate digital inequities among other things? And my whole thing is, if we're including all the entire school community in the conversation, we can look at things like, how do we leverage it as a meaningful digital resource to augment many of the things that all the research, all the experts, all that we've all talked about meaningful when it comes to a learning cycle, that can not only provide a useful resource that is often inaccessible, but also do it in a much more efficient capacity. I do want to point out one other thing, that because Kelly mentioned it as well, I do think it's also important to understand what COPA, FERPA, and GDPR actually are. Because I do hear, for example, I hear, especially here in the US, I hear a lot of schools saying, well, we need to make sure it's compliant with FERPA. And I'm like, it doesn't apply to FERPA. FERPA has to do with your attendance records, your discipline records, and your grades. It doesn't apply there. So adding that to the conversation, all it does is obfuscate what you need to know about how these things work. And again, we need to provide guidance, guidelines, and guardrails on how it works. And my whole thing with us in education is, at some point, we have to amplify our collective voice to hold the developers of these platforms accountable. If you notice that they don't answer the questions that most of the time people ask. I've literally asked them, what data sets are in your platform? And then they're either they are vague with their answers, or they're like, well, it's proprietary. And again, for me, my whole thing is, okay, if it's proprietary, then the minute you have a contract with a public school district here in the United States, I can do an open records request and demand to see what your data sets are. Like, we can flip that whole thing around. Instead of us being reactive to what they are selling us, we can be proactive in saying we won't buy it unless there's a degree of ethical transparency, as well as communication on what data sets you're using, how it works, and how it can be effectively implemented within our learning environments.
And I think that's a really important, is this collective capacity of educators and schools around the world really saying, let's hold on here. Let's not be recipients of it. Let's be co-collaborators. Let's have some voice. And what can we do to really ensure those ideas that you're bringing up about the guardrails and also the transparency? And Kelly also put up that in the chat about OpenAI's policy. Kelly, please, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I agree a lot with Ken. We say, oh, OpenAI says anyone over the age of 13, but they explicitly say with a parent or guardian. And unless it's written into your school policy and you have a signed waiver from a parent or guardian to use AI under the 18, we're not doing anything good for us, right? So we could get us in, we can get in trouble, right, by parents if we are using AI without their consent. Also, the other thing with data, we looked at that extensively. A couple of the programs that we're piloting, looking at where our data is stored, and if it's a part of ChatGPT or part of Google or whatever, where is our data, our kids' information, our intellectual property? Where does it go? So that's a valid point by Ken, is it's not just going to the website. Yeah, cool. Check the box. I looked. It's really asking those difficult questions. We all want the tools for the students, but in the end, we are probably one of the most heavy hit cybersecurity people. This business of educating kids, they want our data. So you have to be careful about that.
And I think that's a really good point. And I think sometimes, we get caught up in the nectar of the tools and the flash, and we're not having those deeper questions. And it's great to have people like yourself really highlighting this and saying, hold on here, time out, let's ask those deep questions. Let's make that part of the conversation within the school community. What does that look like for a group of TLK students to really unpack that? What does that mean if I put all my data in there to a company that I know nothing about and there's no transparency? And as Ken was saying, a lot of those policies are to avoid litigation. They're not there for protection. And I think that's really important. We're going to stop here and give you a chance to have a little chat. Nancy's going to throw a slide up, and this is, I'll walk you through it. Where are you and your school 18 months later with your thinking on AI? We're going to ask you to use a prompt, share with others in the room using the following prompt. So you would just go around however you want, and you say, I used to think blah, blah, blah. Now I think blah, blah, blah. And everybody does that, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation, open conversation. So that's our first prompt. And Ken and Kelly will be popping around just to listen in. But we'd like you to have an opportunity now to kind of, with the great provocations and ideas and thoughts that Ken and Kelly have shared, I think you have some ammunition to go ahead and do this activity.
Okay. I also put a copy of the slide in the chat in case you forgot what the question was. And you have about 8 to 9 minutes. There are 4 to 5 people in the room. Say hello, and I will be opening up the rooms right now. I'm just going to pause recording and
yeah, I just want to thank my group. It was just wonderful to have these little conversations. We're going to have another breakout room because I think this is really rich to have these opportunities as we have our 2 wonderful experts sharing some of these ideas. What I'm going to do is flip it and have Ken start. Of course, we have students and we have teachers and school leaders involved, but we have a whole other contingent, Ken, called parents. And, kids are coming with this, teachers are saying this, parents are trying to navigate it. They might be doing it in the context of their professional situation. They might just be reading on social media, or they might be seeing things. There's now a lot of movies and kind of, entertainment, edutainment has kind of taken over with this topic of AI. What are your sign of ideas about parent and what we can do as schools and school leaders for parents?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because this is where you heard me reference earlier, the whole idea around involving the entire school community. So I'll share with you all a story example. One of the districts I work with, they were looking at developing a policy. And for everyone on this call, I think it's important to recognize, and I did put it in the chat as well, all policies around AI should fit within a digital use policy, okay? Because if you do a carve out, then it makes it look like it's something separate and different, okay? So it should fit within a digital use policy. The other thing is that the policy has to be both responsive and dynamic. Think about, the whole point of the title of our time together, 18 months later. How has generative AI changed in the last 18 months? How has it even changed in the last month? And so the whole idea around playing whack-a-mole with your policy is not going to work. So it has to be dynamic and responsive, number one. Number two, when it comes to parents and family engagement, this goes back to what I shared around the importance of media and information literacy, because I've been in the conversation like, oh my God, is it going to take over? Is it going to take over? I'm like, and where are you getting those ideas from? I already know, because that's what's being propagated in many of the social media as well as generalized media circles. But then the other thing for me are things like this. So I had a conversation with a group of parents, and they were like, well, we really want to be able to support our children at home, and we're trying to understand how this works. And I said, well, help me understand a couple of things. How would you like to be able to better support your child at home? And by the way, this story connects to the equity piece that I always bring up. And so their children were emerging multilingual learners, meaning that English is not the primary language spoken in the home. And I said, well, here's something that it can do, and it can do well. And I said, so give me an example of an evening. And to shorten the story, they gave me an example of their evening. And I said, okay, I said, watch what I do. And so this was my prompt. I said, please provide a comprehensive, unabridged list of activities that a parent can do with an emerging multilingual child who's acquiring English. It would occur during dinner time, and each activity has to be no more than 10 minutes and allow for the parent to engage in dialogue, discussion, and learning with their child. Give me an example and provide a justification for each example you provide, and give it to me in a list that could occur over the course of a month. That was essentially my whole prompt, and it gave me a result. And then they saw it and they're like, oh, we didn't think about some of those things. We can do some of the things. So my whole point, even with something like that, is rather than develop this guarded wall policy, it's like include the parents in the conversation, because to me, part of it also connects to the whole idea around what I describe as parenting in the digital age. We can't assume that the parents are going to know and understand the tools, but if we include them in the conversation to augment what's happening with respect to their child's experience, they're a lot more likely to provide additional guidance and guidelines on usage at home.
Absolutely. And I think, a good point that you bring up. We can't just assume that parents know this, and especially in the context of education. We are the experts, and what we can do is we have the skills and the empathy and the dispositions to bring them along. And I love that idea of the parents part of that conversation and that dynamic and evolving policy that's not a separate thing, but that's part of one policy or one set of guidelines. Thank you, Ken. Kelly, now, of course, you work with teachers extensively, and in your podcast, you support a lot of people thinking about this. What do you think regarding equity? Because there's some teachers that are always going to gravitate to this. They love the new tool. They're going to go full steam. And then there are others are going to be more calm. Others are going to try to avoid it. How do schools get equity? Equity in making sure that everybody has as much opportunity, and also in a way that understands their different learning styles or different approaches, because we all come to this in different ways and it takes time to digest change. So what are you seeing, and what are some things you would like to highlight?
That's a funny question, actually, because yesterday I had a teacher who's one of my really good friends, and she finally came to me 6 months later and she says, I'm ready to unpack what you told me 6 months ago. Okay, so I'm ready to really dive in and see what chat GPT and AI is all about. So when we talk about equity, we're not just talking about different district levels, different financial levels. We're talking about different age groups, different, like you said, comfort levels with the tool, and really making sure that we are building this foundation of trust for everyone. And that is one of the major things that I hold dearly, right? It takes a village to raise a child, and we're all counting on everyone in that realm. So we really need to position ourselves to slow down, like Ken said, go fast to slow down, or I forget what he said in the chat, sorry, but we got to position ourselves to learn a lot, but be okay with just pausing. Yeah, be quick, but don't hurry. Be quick, but don't hurry, and pausing and ensuring that happens. And what that means is, maybe a person's not comfortable with putting in their phone number, showing them other avenues where we can go that are safe. For example, I like to bring up Canva to the really, really nervous people when it comes to AI. It's free for every educator out there. There are some things to think about, but for the most part, they're trying to do their best to protect your data. But like Ken said, anything you put online is, forget it. Just assume that it's going to be out there. But I show them Canva, and I show them the magic write, or I show them the magic tool for making a photo. And this opens the eyes of really what is our potential, and now, right now, this is what we're doing. So it's going through and just making sure that you are having these conversations with the people where they are at. Good.
And I think that's so important, is understanding where they're at, because not everybody's at the same place. And I think so often, the people that have kind of bought into the Kool-Aid of AI tend to really dominate, or they're the loudest. That's where all the traffic is. And as Ken was saying, on social and general media, there's all this buzz, but there are some people that are just signing out or are feeling intimidated. So understanding, that's so true what you said, is understanding where people are at and then creating those entry points and places where they can kind of unpack. I love that your colleague came 6 months later, because maybe that was the transition time that this person needed to get comfortable enough to come up to you. So thank you
John,
both.
can I point one thing out real
please,
quick?
absolutely.
So I just, and this goes back to what I was sharing earlier. So I just dropped in the chat Canva's policies around AI safety. Okay. And the reason why I shared that is twofold. One, to the point Kelly just brought up, Canva is freely available to educators. I happen to love Canva for a number of equity reasons, but the reason why I dropped it in the chat is they are upfront about the safeguards that they are attempting to do in the context of AI. And no, it's just for someone to expect it to be perfect would be, it's not possible. But they list all of the problematic things that exist within the data sets and that can be automated with AI, and what they're doing to either how it works or what they're doing to mitigate the effects. And the reason why I share that is because, and that's why I put in the chat, go look at all of these other AI platforms that are popping up left and right for education and see if they have something like this. And that's why I always tell school leaders, district leaders, like, if you don't see something like this, to me, that's your first red flag. And I would start asking questions, because we should know what safeguards are you attempting to implement that justifies or warrants us using our platform in the context of our learning environments.
And Ken, I think what you're bringing up is so important, is those red flags. As school leaders, we need to do due diligence. We can say, okay, I'm tired. Okay, we'll approve this because somebody down the line approved it, or my neighbor down the street. But I think we need to do due diligence. And I always bring it back to when social media came back. Everybody was excited about Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. But now we know that the payoffs, we went very quickly and a lot of things got broken. And now we have some serious issues for children with online predators. And I know people think, oh, you're overreacting, but there is growing evidence that there is just some things about social media that aren't good for adolescents. And so
Exactly.
I think what you're saying is, again, really important. I think it's a perfect time to break into another breakout room with the people that you have been chatting to. Nancy's going to throw the slide on. Consider how you are currently engaging with AI tools or not. Think of this prompt: I want to stop, I want to start, I want to continue. So think about what you're doing. Maybe now that you've heard Ken and Kelly talk, you might want to stop something, you might want to start something, or you might want to continue with what you're doing. So we're going to have 8 minutes, and thank you again. Adam, we will have a bigger breakout room at the end. So thank you for asking. That's a great question. So we'll go into the breakout rooms, Nancy, please.
Yes, and the rooms are a little bit small. I think it's now 11 minutes before the hour, John. So
Okay.
I'll make it about 5 minutes, because with smaller
Perfect.
rooms, and this
Yeah.
way we have a little bit of time to open up the forum
Yeah.
for questions.
Yeah,
Okay, everybody?
absolutely.
So the rooms are 4 to 3, everybody, and I will open the rooms right now.
Have a good conversation, and Ken and Kelly will pop around so you get a chance also to have them hear what you're saying.
Exactly. So the rooms are, we might have some movement, but that's okay. All right, I'm going to open up the room.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, we could spend the next 7 hours, and if we all had a decent bottle of something on our table, we'd be happy. But the reality is time's running out. And what I want to do is make sure that I think Adam had suggested if we could open it up. So why don't we do this? If somebody's comfortable just sharing a question that might provoke some responses, and I'm going to ask a question to Kelly and then a question to Ken. And hopefully, if we have enough time, we can do 2 questions, but let's start with Ken, 1 question each. So Kelly, I'm opening the floor. Does somebody have a question for Kelly, or just a question? We'll ask Kelly to answer it. And if you don't,
Put me on the spot.
Sorry, Kelly, but I know you can do this.
Do we have any
Anybody have a
computer
question?
science people out there, or any curricular ideas? I love those questions. The data stuff is the boring part for some people, you know, the privacy and everything. It's the actually working with it.
Okay, because time's running out, I'm
Yep.
going to ask you a curricular question. So Kelly, should AI be explicitly integrated into the curriculum as either knowledge, skills, or values, or all three?
For me, all three, but carefully, right? As a computer science teacher, I can't avoid AI because most of our editors already have AI built in. So yes, yes, and yes. We need to teach kids what AI is, where it's coming, the data. We need to build that into our curriculum. Your educators, the people that you work with, need to also have that knowledge about what it is. So yes, yes, and yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Great. Thank you. A question for Ken? Or was there a question here? Maybe there is one in the chat. Oh yeah.
I just dropped that in the chat for Kelly, because it's a conversation that comes up all the time.
So I'm going to tell you, Kelly is doing a podcast on that. So go to Teaching Python, and she's going to be looking for some people. Kelly, what do you think, Ken? Should we stop teaching coding? Ken,
Ken, not me.
Oh,
you? Yes.
you're asking me my own question.
Yes, of course. If you ask a question, you have to answer
Look,
it.
I'll happily answer it. So there's a couple of things. So one, I put in the chat earlier. I am of the disposition that no comprehensive approach to literacy can effectively occur outside of any use of educational technology, as well, including artificial intelligence, period. I'll just share with everybody here. I define literacy in 5 dimensions, which is reading, writing, speaking, listening, and observing. And so when it comes to conversation around coding, is there a need to understand how to do line item coding? I don't know that there is, but what I do know is you do still have to understand coding, because I can have AI generate code for me, but how do I know that the code works? How do I know that it's going to fit what my needs are? How do I know, how can I vet it properly? And so I don't think that we need to, the term I love to share is that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think we need to throw coding out instruction entirely, but it should include the use of AI, because there's source code that is readily available. And my whole thing is, great, it's readily available, but how do you know it's going to work? And how do you have the protocols to be able to troubleshoot it? That same thing applies, that same literacy approach applies with the large language models, again, around the use of syntax structure, the use of story, the use of descriptors when it comes to our narratives. Again, it's this whole thing, and it was in the breakout room I was in, is this whole thing around looking at it completely differently, not as a replacement, but to augment many of the things that we value in education and a lot of the things that we are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tammy here says we have to have that threshold understanding to be able to critique the output. And I think that's so
Right.
important. And I think, what Kelly and Ken are both saying, it's not only coding. If you're doing literature circles and you're starting to have the AI analyze a book and create learning centers or activities, differentiated activities, make sure that the chapter it's referring to is actually correct. Because I've done this where I've tried to ask for resources, and it was actually, I was doing an example to people how you have to be careful, and it produced great resources. It was like, what are the 5 key resources parents should have on AI or articles? And it gave me 5. Out of the 5, 4 were garbage. They led to this page can't be found. So let's not, I think, what Ken is saying is so important. Kelly, please.
Yeah, so I want to go on further that there's a lot of things to go with the code and making code. Most of my students, and I won't say all because we always have a few that aren't the best coders, but most of my students, when we generate code from AI, can at least look at the code and say, yeah, that makes an app that will extract data from a web page. Great. That's what I wanted, but I want to tweak it and I want to get something else. So we're thinking of how to use this AI to really push the boundaries. I use it a lot for flipped classrooms, and you can use this a lot for science, math, social studies, whatever. Go home tonight and go learn about X. Anything you can come up with. Just go learn, learn, learn. Tomorrow we're having a Socratic circle. We're going to talk about it. Or tomorrow we're going to discuss this code in class. So we're empowering the kids to have this agency at home to focus on that learning, to learn how they learn best and bring it back into the schools. So there's a potential to really increase that intellectual knowledge faster for the kids, bringing it back into the class so we can make sure it's accurate knowledge and that we can do something with it. And it's a fun time to be a coder for me, because the projects that kids are making are phenomenal. So
Awesome. And I love that idea of going out and then coming back. And a really important sentence you say, that we check that it's accurate, that we're there, we're the gatekeepers and have the critical thinking skills. That's why the professional development piece, as Ken was talking about, is so critical. You can't really engage in this narrative if you're not explicitly spending time on media literacy with your teachers and your leaders. You know, do they know what deep fakes are? So I know we've run out of time. Ken and Kelly, it's always such a privilege and honor to have you both. I always love what you guys do. And if you are not spending any time, go and check their bios on the page. Ken and Kelly do some phenomenal work. Kelly has a great podcast. Ken does a lot of speaking. He has a book coming out. I can't wait to read it. And we'll definitely be doing a podcast, Ken, when that comes out. And I want to thank Nancy for letting us have this platform, and everybody in this room that took the time from a busy day to share their thoughts and engage in these conversations. And there are many more to have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, can we unmute and give a very big round of applause to Kelly and Ken and John? I am just amazed at the knowledge that I don't have after this session. So everybody, unmute everybody. They're doing virtual. Everybody, virtual. And before we go, I do have a tradition with the loft. First of all, to thank our presenters for taking their time. I mean, this session was, I think, inspirational. The second is our closure is, we believe that even though we can't see each other in the same room, I like to think that right now I have John on one side and Adam on the other, and I'm just going to high five them before I leave this room. So put your hands up, everybody, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, high five. And guess what? I need to take your picture, because everybody who knows I love taking pictures of high fives. So guess what? You have to do it again, because I was high fiving with you. So everybody, hands up. Wait a minute, hands up. High five. Beautiful. 1, 2, 3. High five. Woohoo! You are fabulous. I hope you can come again. And I see your hand raised. Is that because you want to say goodbye, or you did it by mistake?
It automatically caught my high five as a hand raise.
We love it. Goodbye, everybody. We feel privileged that you spent this time with us. Hope to see you at another loft. Bye-bye, everyone, and thank you.
Bye, thank you.
And Ken,
Thank
stay
you,
on.
Ken.
I need to get a group picture.
Thank you all.
thank you.